Hello, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first annual Menil Drawing Institute Pre-Doctoral lecture. My name is Eduard Kopp, I'm Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute. The Menil Drawing Institute is a program of the Menil Collection in Houston, which has its own dedicated building on the Menil campus that was designed specifically for the needs of drawings. At the core of the Institute's mandate is to champion drawing as an autonomous medium and to probe the very nature and the boundaries of modern contemporary drawing by fostering scholarship and connoisseurship and by raising the public awareness and the general understanding of drawing. While our focus is on the period ranging from the late 19th century to today, it's also within the Institute's remit to situate drawing in a broad historical perspective, which is done through exhibitions, research, publications, and programming. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to briefly mention the Drawing Institute Fellowship Program. It is a key component of the Institute as it aspires to become a major research center on modern contemporary drawing. The program fosters the highest level of scholarship and makes possible rich, interdisciplinary, object-based conversations on the drawing medium's history, theory, criticism, and practice. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Saskia Verlaan. Hello, Saskia.
Hi, Edouard.
So Saskia is the inaugural pre-doctoral fellow at the Menil Drawing Institute. She's a PhD candidate in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. And under the advisement of Professor Emily Braun, she's writing a dissertation examining drawing by a range of artists in Italy during the 1960s and 70s. And countering a historiography that has often privileged the sculpture, installation, and performance works central to Arte Povera, Saskia's dissertation really unearths and asserts drawing as a vital sphere of activity during this period. Verlaan gained her MA at the Courtauld Institute in London, and she's currently on leave from the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, where she has managed their collection for a decade. She has also held staff positions at the Grey Art Gallery in New York University and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So our talk today, it relates to doctoral research, but it's also results from our engagement with the Menil deep holdings of Twombly's work. The title of the lecture is Twombly, Leonardo da Vinci, Bodies of Drawing. So Saskia has kindly agreed to take questions after a presentation. Please submit them via the Zoom's Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screens at any time throughout the program. And the hope is that she will address as many of your questions as possible towards the end. And should you encounter any technical difficulty, please message us using the chat function. And please note that the entire event is being recorded and will be made available on the Menil's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. For more details, please check the Menil website at www.menil.org. So now, Saskia, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Edouard, for that wonderful introduction. Before I start my talk, I want to extend my warm thanks to Nicola Del Roscio and Eleonora Di Erasmo at the Twombly Foundation, Gina Guy and Francine Snyder at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, my advisor, Professor Emily Braun, for her always illuminating advice and steadfast encouragement, and of course, my wonderful colleagues here at the Menil and the Menil Drawing Institute, especially Edouard, Rebecca Rabineau, Kelly Montana, Jan Barant, Brian Chappell, David Aylesworth, Lauren Gottlieb Miller, Tony Martinez, Lauren Pollock, and Charlotte Healy, who have all been incredibly generous in sharing their time, help, suggestions, and wisdom, both on this project and more broadly during my time here. This has been such a fulfilling and stimulating fellowship, and it has been a real joy to be immersed in the rich intellectual culture around drawings fostered here at the Menil Drawing Institute. On that note, I'm going to cue up the images for my talk today, Twombly, Leonardo da Vinci, Bodies of Drawing. In the winters of 1968 and 1971, Twombly created a remarkable series of drawing collages featuring images of works by the Italian Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci. On the screen, I am illustrating a late example from the group, a work that resides in the Menil collection and that first sparked my interest in the series. In it, at upper center, Twombly has taped a facsimile of a Leonardo sketch and framed it within the cut and folded sheet of the support. Twombly has amended and obscured portions of Leonardo's image with his own strident overdrawings in crayon and graphite, but the sketch remains recognizable as one of the master draftsman's detailed anatomical studies of the arm and hand, now in the British Royal Collection at Windsor Library and pictured here on the right. Below and around the reproduction, Twombly fills the page with his own distinctive style of scrawled lines and cryptic written notations that often devolve into incoherence. Twombly appears to have sampled his images from a book on Leonardo, although the specifics of which publication remain obscure. Nicola Del Roscio, Twombly's longtime assistant, now president of the Twombly Foundation, recalls that it was an inexpensive catalog of Leonardo's work, perhaps connected to an exhibition, but no remnant of the book survives in Twombly's archive, and I have been unable to match the images to any of the era-appropriate publications on Leonardo I have consulted. Even without knowing Twombly's source, his selections from Leonardo's work are plainly intriguing. As in the Menil example, all the Leonardo images featured in Twombly's collages derive from his extensive body of sketches. There are no paintings or even any of the highly finished preparatory drawings involved in the planning of such works. Twombly drew instead from several thematic wells of Leonardo's graphic corpus. The 16 works include specimens from the Renaissance master's careful life studies of horses, his architectonic renderings of drapery, his carefully theorized analyses of floods and storms, and his groundbreaking investigations of anatomy. Minor works, in other words, if such a thing can be said to exist for Leonardo, but of the type that exemplify the deft, probing visual research that has defined Leonardo's reputation as a relentless observer of nature and a towering figure in the world of drawing. Across his 16 works, Twombly adopted the distinctive format as seen in the Menil work, and here in a collage featuring one of Leonardo's studies of the muscles in the upper spine. A single Leonardo sketch, often marked upon directly in Twombly's hand, is taped into the upper register of the composition and surrounded by drawings in various media that function as a response to or commentary on the image. In other words, these are drawings that respond to drawing. The nature of that response varies across the compositions, or I should say evolves. That's my subject for today's talk. While individual and small groups of the collages have occasionally been exhibited and published in the 5 decades that have elapsed since they were made, Twombly's Leonardo series has never before been studied closely as a discrete corpus of work. On top of that, much of the iconography in the collages, particularly that concerning the human body, has been overlooked. In addressing the series today, I want to focus on a progression I see unfolding across the collages, an evolving palimpsestic dialogue with and instrumentation of Leonardo that begins in the earliest works as an intimate, often humorous examination of personal history and private eroticism, and transitions across the series into a more expansive and nuanced exploration of drawing as an inherited cultural practice and sensory experience. Before getting into the collages further, I want to offer a few remarks on Twombly's relationship to Leonardo and the ways in which he practiced reference in his art. Notably, the collages weren't Twombly's first allusion to Leonardo. In 1960, he made a painting titled To Leonardo, part of a suite of works similarly dedicated to admired artistic forebears, a group that included both artists and writers such as the poet Sappho. Largely abstract, To Leonardo features Twombly's signature glyph-like pencil drawings and occasional scrawled inscriptions. The work's connection to its titular subject, however, is largely inscrutable in terms of recognizable imagery. although the scribbled mass that appears at lower left likely derives from Leonardo's deluge images, which would resurface in Twombly's collages nearly a decade later. Twombly scholars such as Heiner Bastian have also noted the likely influence of these dynamic sketches exploring the elemental forces of wind and water on the looping, spiraling gestures Twombly adopted in his so-called Gray Groundworks, a series he began in 1966. Several examples of these works can be seen in the Twombly Pavilion at the Menil, including 1967, illustrated here. It was not until the collages begun in 1968, however, that Twombly made such direct visual citation of Leonardo's work. In fact, the collages represent an entirely new mode for him, marking the first time he directly appropriated another artist's image. He would later go on to occasionally embed works by Nicolas Poussin, tourist photographs, and botanical illustrations in collages formally similar to his Leonardo series. But his engagement with Leonardo remains singular in its intensity. On the whole, Twombly's art is much better known for its textual references. In addition to inscribing his works with names and well-known titles from art history, he frequently sampled words and phrases lifted from sources including classical myths, histories, and the writings of poets he admired, such as Virgil, Rilke, and Mallarmé. Responding to the artist's habit of embedding significant words, phrases, or names into his work, the French literary theorist, philosopher, and semiotician Roland Barthes identified Twombly's canny ability to invest these bits of language with deep cultural resonance. Barthes observes that the name Virgil, for instance, evoked by Twombly in several works like the one illustrated here, does more than reference the ancient Roman poet. Rather, the name, so conspicuously handwritten, becomes a kind of nostalgic synecdoche, a part representing a whole, for an entire millennia-spanning tradition of elite learning dedicated to the study of the classics. Leonardo, himself a devoted student and deep admirer of the ancients, as he called them, fits neatly into this broader genealogy of culture. Additionally, it's easy to intuit some of the formal elements that might have attracted Twombly to Leonardo's sketches. Leonardo's frequent annotation of his drawings in his elegant script evokes Twombly's own highly lexical works. That Leonardo wrote backwards, a habit brilliantly designed to accommodate his left-handedness, must have delighted Twombly, whose own imagistic writing often frustrates comprehension. Similarly, Leonardo's habit in his sketches of placing disparate motifs haphazardly on the same sheet, making them read like the scattered snatches of thought they likely were, rhymes with Twombly's own free associative methods of organizing pictorial space. Then, too, there is the matter of Leonardo's rumored love affairs with men. Living in an era hostile to non-heteronormative expressions of sexual orientation, Twombly was extremely guarded about the intimate relationships he maintained beyond his marriage to the artist Tatiana Franchetti, but may well have been drawn to this aspect of Leonardo's biography. At the same time, Twombly's riff on Leonardo, justly credited as one of the most expert and influential draftsmen to have ever lived, who prized his observing eye above all else, seems an ironic choice for an artist who earlier in his career had practiced drawing in the dark in order to subdue the trained and lyrical quality of his hand. Twombly's interest in Leonardo's anatomical studies also surprises, given the resolutely non-figurative nature of his own work. Returning to the collages now, we know from their dates and inscriptions that Twombly created all of the works on two separate visits to the Captiva Island estate of his close friend and fellow artist, Robert Rauschenberg. Twombly resided primarily in Rome throughout the 60s and 70s, where he had moved in 1957 and remained after his marriage to Franchetti in 1959. But he would spend long stretches of time in the United States, circulating between New York, where he was represented by the Leo Castelli Gallery, and Lexington, Virginia, his birthplace. In deep winter, he enjoyed escaping the cold of the Northeast for the warm Gulf climate of Captiva. His visits pepper the calendars Rauschenberg kept in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and could be quite long, sometimes lasting several weeks. During his visits, he maintained a studio and bedroom in a cottage on the property. Turning to the 1968 collages, the most unexpected feature of Twombly's engagement with Leonardo is his body irreverence. In what appear to be his earliest appropriations, Twombly used the Renaissance master's carefully observed studies as the basis for a series of dirty jokes and erotic contemplations. One of the works takes up a Leonardo study of a horse anatomy, showing the rear of a stallion. At the top of the sheet, Twombly has inscribed the words culo de cavallo. The spelling of culo has one too many L's, but anyone familiar with Italian slang knows it as a vulgar term for rump, rear, or backside. Cavallo, meanwhile, is Italian for horse. So here we have a very literal, if rather blue, description of the Leonardo sketch, a horse's ass. A second work featuring the horse motif is cruder still. Upon the appropriated Leonardo sketch, Twombly has scrawled a large cartoonish phallus. Below the image, he's drawn multiple erect and flaccid penises of both the equine and human variety. In a parody of the precise way in which Leonardo documented the horse's proportions in the original drawing, Twombly has annotated his own penile depictions with what appear to be measurements of their length in inches. It's not coincidental that these works emerged during what seems to have been Twombly's first visit to Rauschenberg on Captiva. Twombly was deeply attentive to the locations where he made his works, telling the curator Kirk Barnado on one occasion how he found a certain group of paintings he started in Rome more suitable for the working environment of New York. The frisson of being back together with Rauschenberg, with whom he shared a deep, intimate history, may well have inspired one of the collages. During 1952 and 1953, early in their respective careers, the two artists had traveled to Italy together, sharing funds from a fellowship Twombly had secured to travel abroad. The trip was formative for both men, leading to aesthetic discoveries and professional contacts in Italy that would profoundly impact the direction of their art and lives over the next 2 decades. A photo montage by Rauschenberg memorializes part of that voyage, splicing portraits of the two young artists alongside images of the horses of St. Mark, Byzantine sculptures housed at the Basilica San Marco in Venice. The horse at center bears striking resemblance to one in the Leonardo study on blue paper selected by Twombly for his ribald collage. One can surely argue that many equestrian images share a superficial likeness, but the fact that Twombly made a personal gift of this particular collage to Rauschenberg during his stay suggests a deeper resonance. The work had personal meaning between the two artists, an inside joke shared between old friends. Returning to the other collages, we find that Leonardo's much celebrated intrepidness as a pioneering anatomist offered yet more fodder for scatological and lusty jesting on the part of Twombly. In one collage, he borrows the old master's detailed observations of the mechanical structure of the anus, writing porta, Italian for door, and entrance to nearby. Below, he sketched floating amorphous shapes that are equal parts erotic and excremental. A different work showing Leonardo's image of a man observed from the back repeats the culo and porta jokes, while yet another samples Leonardo's cross-section rendering of the act of human intercourse. On the sheet below the taped-on image, Twombly has recreated the phallus from Leonardo's sketch, which now appears to ejaculate across the empty space of the page. Next to it, Twombly has inscribed the word reject, lending the image decidedly non-procreative and onanistic overtones. In his later years, during one of only 2 on-the-record interviews he ever gave about his art, Twombly dismissed the use of the term graffiti to describe his work. Commentators such as Barnado have similarly argued that the idea that Twombly's signature style derived from his encounters with Roman graffiti, as was so often argued in his early career, is overly reductive. But for these 1968 collages, the term seems apt. In fact, in their subversive irreverence and sexual suggestiveness, the early collages recall that most famous of 20th century acts of symbolic vandalism, Marcel Duchamp's ready-made LHEEQ. Debuted in 1919, the work featured a tourist reproduction of Leonardo's Mona Lisa, hand-modified by Duchamp. In addition to the comical mustache and beard doodled above the sitter's renowned enigmatic smile, Duchamp's titular inscription, the letters LHOOQ, function as an obscene pun when pronounced in his native French that suggests the sitter's sexual readiness and availability. The work parodies the commodification of the painting and the already immense fame and reverence attached to it in the early 20th century, establishing an ironic mode that was destined to be repeated in the decades ahead by many artists, including Rauschenberg. Here, Rauschenberg employed his signature method of transfer drawing, soaking multiple found images of the Mona Lisa in solvent and lightly rubbing them onto the support. The technique highlights the silkscreen printing process involved in the making of the images, relying upon its mass market connotations to suggest how Leonardo's painting has been transformed through repeated reproduction and commodification, a point further underscored by Rauschenberg's title for the work, Currency. LHEEQ and this parodic approach to Leonardo was an unavoidable point of reference for Twombly. Yet if that's the case, it is worthwhile to consider how his appropriation differs. The kinds of works Twombly chose to cite lack the iconic weight of the Mona Lisa. They are far more obscure and would be difficult to identify for viewers only casually familiar with Leonardo. Nonetheless, they are by Leonardo, not just a famed artist, but a famed Italian artist, and one of the revered fathers of the Italian artistic tradition, particularly in drawing. As drawings, they are also freighted with specific connotations of intimacy, in the sense that drawings are often interpreted as being closer to both the mind and hand of the artist, a private window into their creative process. I have already staked out the retrospective aspect that I see in these collages regarding Twombly's relationship with Rauschenberg. However, I believe there is additional personal significance to these works as well. In many ways, Twombly's visit to Rauschenberg falls at an inflection point in his career. To explain this, I want to pause now and sketch in some necessary background on the stylistic and critical circumstances of Twombly's art in the 1960s. His move to Italy in 1957 had coincided with a corporeal shift in his work. Increasingly, he augmented or replaced altogether the viscous house paint he had been using up to that point in canvases such as the work on the screen, Academy from 1955, with thicker, more malleable, and notably more traditional oil paints sold in tubes. We see the arrival, his style evolved alongside his materials, and we see the arrival of a lush manner in Twombly's Ferragosto series, works created in 1961 during the blazing heat of a Roman August. These canvases convey a feeling of sensual abandon in their generously brushed, daubed, and impastoed surfaces, their visceral color schemes of red, pink, and brown, and their barely coded eroticism, filled as they are with glyphs resembling phalluses, breasts, and orifices of all kinds. American audiences would confront Twombly's new style for the first time in 1964, when he showed another series, 9 Discourses on Commodus, at Castelli Gallery. The reception of this show was disastrous. To a New York art world awash in the cool forms of minimalism and the remote irony of pop, Twombly's heavily expressionistic canvases, revolving around the assassination of a despotic Roman emperor, appeared hopelessly mannered and suspiciously foreign. The minimalist artist and critic Donald Judd dashed off a particularly caustic review, labeling the show a, quote, fiasco. While this critical failure looms large in Twombly's biography, he never suffered such defeat in Italy. Throughout the early 1960s, while his career limped along in New York, he was warmly embraced by Italian curators, collectors, and critics. Letters traded between him and his New York dealer, Leo Castelli, touch on his differing fortunes in his native and adopted homes. In April 1961, for instance, after Twombly requested the return of some of his newer works from New York, citing the belief that they would sell more quickly and at higher cost in Italy, Castelli acknowledged his greater success there, lamenting of the US, quote, "I feel ashamed that your country and mine does not give you the recognition, but I intend to go on showing you every year until they wake up," end quote. The discourses on Commodus affair does seem to have prompted a shift in Twombly's style, though. In his next exhibition at Castelli, a full 3 years later, at the end of 1967, he unveiled the aforementioned gray groundworks. With these paintings, Twombly returned to house paint and adopted a pared down aesthetic of chalk-like white lines on monochromatic gray surfaces. These works encountered a vastly different reception. In his review of the show, the critic Max Kozloff favorably compared Twombly's new canvases to the work of his American peers, Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, who, unlike Twombly, had been lionized in New York since the late 1950s. Subtly warning that Twombly's abandonment of the United States would not be forgotten, though, Kozloff also chauvinistically declared him the, quote, "rare instance of an American artist whose work continues to hold interest despite having been uprooted and transplanted to Europe," end quote. Recently, the curator Isabelle Dervaux has suggested that the gray groundworks are not the capitulation to American tastes of the moment that they might seem. Analyzing Twombly's Treatise on the Veil series of gray ground paintings and drawings, she argues that with these works, Twombly responds to minimalism, quote, "in a mode of irony and perversion," end quote, pointing out how he apes minimalist serial procedures and modular units while undermining their typical logic and clean lines. The Leonardo collages fall within the middle of Twombly's campaign of gray groundworks, after he had already met with success in New York. In a different but related vein to what Dervaux identifies in Treatise on the Veil, the collages speak to a defiant attitude on the part of Twombly. In particular, the forward erotic overtones apparent in the collages I have already discussed recall the fleshy imagery of the Ferragosto paintings, suggesting that the artist still embraced the sensual aspects of his work that he had developed in Rome. Less a desecration of the old master's legacy then, the erotic collages stake out Twombly's aesthetic allegiance to his adopted country and his commitment to sensualism in the drawn image. Even as he was making his erotic collages, Twombly was also using Leonardo's sketches to investigate the nature of the drawn line. This can be seen in his decidedly non-erotic use of Leonardo's deluge images and draped figures. In his drawings below the taped-in images, we can see Twombly paraphrasing dynamic lines and plastic forms from within Leonardo's studies. Stacked in registers, these drawings have something of the iterative quality of a Leonardo sketch, wherein the artist would draw and redraw an object multiple times in order to capture its form. This mode seems to carry over in Twombly's final pair of collages from 1968. The first of these works, up on the screen now, features a Leonardo study of the bones and nerves of the leg. The other collage makes use of one of Leonardo's studies of the lumbar plexus, a network of nerves controlling the sensory and motor functions of the lower extremities. As with the deluge and drapery images, Twombly certainly seems to have been attracted to the formal, linear qualities of the anatomical studies, which by virtue of Leonardo's extremely rational schematization appear nearly abstract. Twombly responds to these sketches of bodily systems in much the same way he did to the studies of drapery, visually recapitulating select aspects of Leonardo's wiry drawings in stuttering and wavering lines that arc across the surface of the paper. But Twombly's interest in the nervous system in these works is a tip-off that something more is going on here. This is confirmed in the final 5 collages from the series, which center exclusively on Leonardo's anatomical drawings of the nerves and muscles. These last 5 works arrive in December of 1971, a distance of 3 years from Twombly's first portion of the series. There is no precise explanation for this gap in time beyond the fact that Twombly seemed to like to let certain ideas and bodies of work macerate. He did something very similar with Treatise on the Veil, in fact, making the series in fits and starts across roughly the same period of years. As demonstrated by the horizontally oriented example up on the screen, Twombly's 5 collages in 1971 deviate somewhat from the aggressively vertical structure of the 1968 series, but they otherwise retain a similar format. Across these works, we see Twombly sampling from Leonardo's intricate studies of bodily systems. He revisits his subject from 1968, the leg, in 2 studies of nerves and blood vessels. In another work, he embeds a study of the muscles of the upper spine. He devotes the remaining 2 collages to examinations of the bones, muscles, and nerves of the arm, and the brachial plexus, a network of nerves in the shoulder that controls movement and sensory signals in the arms and hands. Across the works, Twombly fixates on Leonardo's articulation of dense, linear networks, particularly nerves. He sometimes even effaces recognizable features, such as the lightly sketched in foot seen in one of the leg studies. Note how he has also turned the reproduction of Leonardo's sketch on its side, which, along with the blotting out of the foot, makes the image appear more abstract. Yet Twombly's choice of subject, so uniformly focused on nerves and muscles, the agents of sense and movement, simply cannot be considered incidental to these works. I find it notable that, with the exception of the 1968 nude figure seen from behind, none of Twombly's appropriated images ever feature a head or any of its related viscera. Twombly's avoidance of such material is remarkable, given the preponderance of in Leonardo's graphic corpus of heads and their accoutrements. I'm speaking here of eyes and brains. Leonardo's system of bodily measurement gave primacy to the head, seat of the intellect, as did other such types of systems more generally in the Renaissance. Likely because of this, heads become a recurring and favorite subject of his. Leonardo heavily populated his drawings with heads in various positions and guises, from serene youths to grizzled old men. Moreover, the artist devoted considerable time and attention to investigating the anatomy of the brain, cranium, and the mechanics of vision, seen in just a few sketches on the screen. Twombly's avoidance of this kind of material in favor of selections focused on muscles and nerves elsewhere in the body suggests a privileging of the ability to move, feel, and act, as opposed to the capacity to see, think, and reason that is associated with the head, eyes, and brain. The Menil Collage, featuring a study of the arm with a prominent hand, particularly stands out in this respect. The drawing scholar Deanna Petherbridge tells us that, quote, hands bear a symbolic connection with the manual aspects of drawing, as opposed to the intellectual aspects of disegno, end quote. Disegno is the Renaissance concept that understood drawing as originating in the mind. Twombly's emphasis on the feeling and performing body refocuses our attention onto the collages themselves. Not only is the feeling, sensing body depicted in the image, it is coded within the tactile qualities and corporeal presence of the physical surfaces of the works. Countering the linguistic associations with the word surface as superficial or lacking in depth, the material culture historian Victoria Kelly observes that surface, quote, is the part of an object that is most accessible to our senses, often the only part that can be directly seen or touched, at least on first encounter, end quote. Though difficult to grasp in reproductions, nearly all the collages, both from 1968 and 1971, manifest a dense material presence that asserts itself in person. The Menil Collage will again serve as our example. Leonardo's drawing appears almost enshrined within the page, resting within the paper carapace that runs along the top of the sheet. Rather than pasting down the Leonardo image, Twombly instead secured it with tape, a practice observed across the other collages as well. The use of tape at only the top of the collaged image, as opposed to glue or paste along the entire verso, imbues it with additional dimensionality. Unfixed at the bottom, the collage sheet of the reproduction can pull ever so slightly away, allowing for shadow play. In a number of the works, Twombly further heightens this effect by layering multiple sheets of paper to form the support, sometimes alternating cut and torn sheets to create a dynamic play of smooth and rough texture. In several of the 1971 collages, as in the Menils, he further increases the spatial complexity, carefully cutting and folding the paper in ways that give the collages a relief-like presence. This effectively grants characteristics of the flayed bodies from Leonardo's human specimens to the body of the artwork itself, opening it up to sensual exploration. Twombly's markings further the sensual play of texture in the collage. Using different media such as graphite, crayon, and felt tip pen, he frequently draws directly across the seams of the layered papers or over pieces of tape, creating slight visual disturbances in the line that underscore the composite nature of the underlying surface. In the rare events where Twombly discussed his art, he often emphasized the physical sensation of making over the visual experience of it. In 1957, he penned a statement on his work for an issue of the Italian aesthetic journal, L'Esperienza Moderna, describing line as an, quote, experience with its own innate history. He continues, it does not illustrate, it is the sensation of its own realization. The imagery is one of the private or separate indulgences rather than an abstract totality of visual perception, end quote. What Twombly describes here is line as index, an inscribed memory of a performed gesture. Some 43 years later, at the turn of the millennium, Twombly again emphasized the somatic immediacy of his working method in an interview with David Sylvester. Quote, it's more like I'm having an experience than making a picture. He continues, it's instinctive to a certain kind of painting, not as if you were painting an object or special things, but it's like coming through the nervous system. It's not described, it's happening. The line is the feeling, end quote. I noted at the outset of this lecture that Twombly's citation of Leonardo might seem odd for an artist who had made concerted efforts to divorce his hand and eye. Twombly's use of the old master's anatomies to prioritize the somatic experience of drawing over the visual observation Leonardo painstakingly cultivated and so obviously prized might seem to reinforce this. Should we then read these works as another form of ironic distancing, a repudiation of Leonardo and what he represents? I would say no. There's a pedagogical purpose to anatomical drawing, particularly the kinds of partial views by Leonardo that Twombly gravitated towards. They fit within a tradition of academic instruction in the art of drawing. While apparently none of Leonardo's anatomical studies were published in his own lifetime, the Renaissance drawing scholar Carmen Bombach notes that his innovative methods of illustrating dissected muscles and his techniques for clearly delineating complex bodily systems became widely disseminated among Italian Renaissance practitioners. Twombly's recapitulation of Leonardo's markings and his overdrawing recalls this tradition, wherein younger artists would copy parts of the human body drawn by an established master. In layering Leonardo's images into his own compositions and tracing over Leonardo's marks, Twombly also takes on characteristics of the palimpsest, a term used to define a partially effaced or overwritten text or manuscript. While the strategy here is primarily non-textual, although not completely so, given this is Twombly, his overdrawings are evocative of the accretive qualities of palimpsest. His collages layer different historical moments in both personal and epochal terms. Returning to Twombly's collage featuring Leonardo's study of the arm and hand, I want to call your attention to the way in which Twombly has drawn over the lines used to define the nerves. It becomes difficult to tell where Leonardo's marks end and his begin. From the fingers of Leonardo's hand, Twombly flows the line down, beyond the confines of the image, past the borders of the sheet, and onto the new support he has laid down. Far from creating ironic distance, the work forms a bridge in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saskia, for such a closely argued and sensitive and observant lecture, and clearly very rich subject that you've started to open up. And I had a question for you. And by the way, I'm inviting all our audience members to submit questions via the Q&A function if they wish to at any moment. I had a question about mise en page, so the kind of strategy of display. And I don't know if you could speak a little more to that, how you've talked a little bit about the orientation with which he places the collages, but I wonder also if you thought about the placement within the sheets and then the placement of his own sort of added marks around that, and how does that work as a system, if you will?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's very interesting, you know, across these works. The main work that I've been able to observe in person is, of course, the Menils. And one of the things that struck me immediately about that was the kind of prominence of the Leonardo and how it's almost, I mean, I talk about it being kind of enshrined within the page, but it is really in pride of place. And with all of these works, there is this sense, if you compare it to something like Rauschenberg's Currency, where the Mona Lisa is kind of worked into the image, but certainly not the primary focus, I think that there's a real investment in these images and a real kind of, you know, that's why I kind of look away from this idea of it being entirely ironic, that there's yeah, this investment in Leonardo and this kind of fascination with him. And, you know, I think we've talked a little bit about the kind of differences of his strategy with Leonardo, the kind of the density of Leonardo's images versus the space that Twombly can create around his images. Yeah, I think that I think it's fascinating that with him, it's just so specifically about this image, that it's not, you know, that there's, and then I think that the markings around the works are about his personal responses to it, which with Twombly can be, you know, there is always meaning to what those marks are, but it's often quite opaque for the viewer. You can kind of pick up aspects of it. Like, it's very common in these collages for him to write the date they were made, but also the place. Like captiva actually features as a word that's written into the collages. So there's, and you know, I mean, there's such a rich body of work. There's so many areas that you can go into this. He actually, in one of them, is quoting Mallarmé, but there's always, you're not like, these kinds of quotes appear in his work, you know, across a span of years, and they certainly have very personal significance, but it's often quite vague for the viewer. There's not a, you know, you kind of, it's conjuring a feeling. And I think that's, he wants you to kind of be in that mode and bring something personal to it.
Yeah, I mean, what's striking is, you know, the apparent contrast between Leonardo's idea of art, as we know he thought that art is a mental thing, and then the somatic or sensual approach that Twombly adopts, and with which he surrounds these images of Leonardo's drawings.
Yeah, no, I think it is really interesting because they are two very different artists in that respect, and that was something that kind of, as I was working on this, I thought, yeah, it is so strange for him to actually be looking at, you know, the most visually oriented of artists, somebody who is just, you know, seeing and observing the world and translating that through his hand always. But when I started to think about this, that's the connection that I want to make with the academic drawing, is that Twombly is kind of in a mode of admiration, taking that and applying his own theory of drawing to it. So he's still learning from Leonardo, but he's going to do it entirely on his own terms. So it's translating, it's like, it's his response to the master in his own vein that is entirely his idiom of working through the body, through sensation, coming through the nervous system. And I think it's just this very brilliant bridge that he kind of creates between their work.
What's remarkable with Leonardo's drawing is the specificity, the precision of his, not just the drawings, but also the complementary inscriptions and the strong didactic quality. I mean, he's teaching himself, but that he could teach anyone with these things. And you showed very well how Twombly did something similar when he picks up some lines or some possible alternatives, approaches to line. And there's a sense in which he seems to be teaching himself or learning something and spelling it out, but then it's not as it's much more evocative than it is prescriptive as it is in Leonardo's drawings.
Yeah, definitely.
So Saskia, there's a question from someone in the audience. And the question is, did Twombly discuss why or how he came to begin these works with Leonardo's images?
No, so he was, incredibly reticent about talking about his work. And he was, there's really only 2 interviews with him and then the statement that he makes in 1957. And other than that, he was very reluctant to discuss, why, he would settle upon certain themes. So it's been, I haven't really found much in terms of him talking about Leonardo. I suspect that, early on in the literature, you see people like Heiner Bastian start talking about Leonardo and his influence on the great groundworks. And I suspect that came out of maybe conversations between Twombly and Heiner Bastian, that he even nodded towards this. But, he, in one of those late interviews that he gave, he spoke about, he was asked why he didn't like to speak about his work. And he said, well, it's a little self-indulgent. It's like talking about yourself, really. And so there's a sense in which that can be difficult as an art historian, where you really want to know why they did what, why an artist did what they did, or what got him interested in this. But at the same time, I think that his position is that this is there, it's in the work. My work is the statement on what I'm doing. So you kind of go back and you can go back to look at the work and try to, it's also a fascinating puzzle to kind of see what he saw in these works.
So Saskia, I see another question which starts with a comment. Thank you for this illuminating talk. Twombly seems centrally concerned with line itself. Is he informing his own sense of line in a way by exploring Da Vinci's work?
I think he definitely is. Yes, he, that really comes through in that series of, I think, it starts with the deluges and the drapery, where you really see him looking at the lines and kind of following lines in this way, especially like down below on this lower register, you kind of see him pulling out elements from that and thinking about how the line is formed there. And especially with the deluges too, those works are so, they're Leonardo investigating natural phenomena through almost physics and thinking about, he was really precisely thinking about how, water would be shaped in that way. And he was somebody who was just also intently fascinated with the movements of water. So, when you see those kind of looping lines, that is something that Twombly is taking from those works. But it's fascinating then to see how he carries it into the nervous system works, because that was something that, it's very striking when you're in front of these, and hopefully even in reproduction, how he's kind of really gravitated towards these works that are they're very specific types of anatomical drawings with the nerves and muscles, and they're all incredibly striated. And Leonardo's line is also so dynamic. So that is definitely, I think, a point of reference for him.
So Saskia, early in your talk, you mentioned that Twombly also had a strong connection with Nicolas Poussin, the 17th century classical painter. And I found a quote that says that apparently Twombly said that it was his desire, I quote, to have been Poussin if I had a choice in another time. And, you know, it's quite interesting because if you think of Poussin's very intellectual approach to composition and very strict approach to composition, it seems so far away on the face of it from Twombly's approach. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about this other body of work and how his reference to Poussin is similar or different from his reference to Leonardo's work.
Yeah, I think like Leonardo, there's, you know, Twombly has Poussin is the other artist that Twombly has a kind of major engagement with through his career. And in that, I show that early work to Leonardo. There's also a work that's similarly dedicated to Poussin there. And so he's coming back to him over and over. And after the Leonardo series of collages, he also begins to do something similar with select Poussin works, embedding them into collages that are actually quite visually similar to this. I think there's, you know, a few things that really, you know, attract him to Poussin. There's for one point, like for one aspect, it's Poussin, like Twombly, was an artist who was a foreigner who came to Rome and really adopted it as his home, and kind of, you know, he went back to France for a period, but he ultimately settled in Rome, and that was really where he kind of uncovered his art and, you know, became the artist that he was. So I think that just in terms of, just in a biographical way, I think that there's something that's very there's a very strong affinity between the two of them. And then there are certain interests, you know, in terms of poetry, and particularly pastoral poetry, and, you know, how they're responding in, as you say, in very different idioms, but it's a huge influence for both of them, and classical culture, how Poussin is embedding that into his work and kind of making these depictions of this kind of pastoral classical landscape. And then there's also just, you know, actually Twombly was an artist who was very interested in nature and, you know, natural observation, and that is constantly being worked into his art. And so I think, you know, they have this, you know, very different response to landscape, but there's still a very strong affinity between the two of them.
Saskia, thank you. I'm afraid we're reaching the end of our time together, but thank you again for such illuminating talk. There's clearly a lot more to think about. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on this subject. And also I'd like to thank our audience members. And please visit the Menil website if you would like to learn about future programs. So anyway, thank you very much, Saskia, and thanks to everyone. And we hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.